I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The rain in Lochdeverf did not fall so much as it drifted in fine, grey curtains that turned the peaks of the Killins into ghostly memories and the main street into a glistening ribbon of wet slate. Inside the police station, a small, whitewashed cottage that smelled perpetually of damp wool, wood smoke, and Lugs's doggy coat. PC Hamish Macbeth sat with his long, thin legs stretched toward a dying peat fire. In his hand was a mug of coffee that was mostly chicory and hope, and on his lap was a fraying paperback he'd already read twice. The phone rang with a persistent, jarring rattle that echoed off the low ceiling. Hamish didn't move. He knew that sound. It was the shrill, demanding tone of Detective Chief Inspector Blair's secretary in Strathbane, likely calling to complain about a missing set of quarterly statistics or a misplaced form regarding sheep dipping regulations. Hamish closed his eyes and practiced his most important professional skill, being invisible. If he didn't answer, he couldn't be given any work. If he wasn't given any work, he couldn't be promoted. And if he wasn't promoted, he could stay right here in the Highlands where a man could breathe. Beside him, Lugs, an orange-furred mongrel of dubious parentage and sharp intelligence, thumped his tail against the floorboards. The dog knew Hamish was skiving, but Lugs was a master of discretion. The peaceful silence was shattered not by the phone, but by the arrogant roar of an engine that had no business being in a Sutherland village. A sleek, silver Range Rover, the kind that had never seen a speck of real mud screech to a halt outside, splashing a tidal wave of puddle water against the station's windows. Out stepped Mr. Percy Thorne. He was a Sassenach of the most irritating variety, wealthy, loud, and possessed of the unshakable belief that the Highlands were a theme park designed for his personal amusement. He wore a brand-new tweed jacket that cost more than Hamish made in 6 months, and a pair of yellow Wellington boots that screamed Londoner on holiday. Percy burst into the station without knocking, bringing a gust of cold, wet air with him. "You, Macbeth, are you deaf as well as indolent?" Hamish looked up slowly, his expression settling into the mask of vacant, pleasant stupidity he used to navigate the world of authority. "Ah, Mr. Thorne. It's the rain, sir. It muffles the ears. Was there something I could be doing for you?" "My peacocks," Percy shouted, slamming a gloved hand onto Hamish's desk. "2 of them are missing from the estate. I've spent £20,000 landscaping that garden, and now your wretched local poachers have probably turned my ornamental birds into soup. I demand an immediate investigation. Fingerprints. Door-to-door inquiries. The lot." Hamish sighed inwardly. Peacocks in Lochdeverf were about as popular as a tax collector at a wedding. The birds were loud, territorial, and had recently taken to pecking the paint off Mrs. Kennedy's car. "Peacocks are wanderers by nature, sir," Hamish drawled, his Highland accent thick and deceptive. "They likely just went for a bit of a stroll toward the mountains. The air is very bracing this time of year." "Don't give me that simple crofter routine," Percy snapped. "I know you people. You're all in league together. If those birds aren't back by sunset, I'm calling the chief constable. I didn't retire to this godforsaken damp hole to be robbed by peasants." He spun on his heel and marched back to his silver beast, the engine roaring as he sped toward the Lochdeverf Hotel. Hamish watched the taillights fade into the mist. Percy Thorne had been in the village for exactly 3 weeks, and in that time he had managed to threaten the postmistress, insult the minister, and suggest that the local fishing boats be moved because they ruined the vista. "Lugs," Hamish murmured, reaching down to scratch the dog's ear. "I have a terrible feeling that Mr. Thorne's peacocks are going to be the least of our worries. A man like that shouldn't make so many enemies in a place where the mountains have such long memories." He stood, his stomach rumbling. His plan for a quiet afternoon of poaching a salmon from the Colonel stretch of the river was ruined. In Lochdeverf, when the outsiders started shouting, the locals started whispering. And when the whispering started, trouble was never far behind. The silver Range Rover had barely vanished into the swirling grey mist before Hamish Macbeth allowed his shoulders to slump. He reached down to scratch Lugs behind a tattered ear. the dog offering a sympathetic whine that mirrored his master's weary mood. Percy Thorne was the sort of man who brought his own weather with him, a storm of indignation and self-importance that threatened the delicate, lazy ecosystem of Lockduff. Hamish stood up, his joints protesting the sudden movement, and wandered into the small scullery to check on his meagre supplies. He had been looking forward to a quiet afternoon of poaching a salmon from the Colonel's stretch of the river. But the unsettled feeling in his gut told him that his stove would likely remain cold. A man like Thorne didn't just ruffle feathers. He tore them out by the handful, and in a village like this, such behavior was usually met with a very permanent kind of silence. The mist was thickening now, turning the harbor into a ghost world where the masts of the fishing boats looked like skeletal fingers poking through the gloom. Hamish donned his waterproof greatcoat, whistled for lugs, and stepped out into the damp chill. He decided a walk to the Lockduff Hotel was in order, perhaps to coax a free sandwich out of Nellie the cook, or at least to see if Mr. Thorne had managed to offend anyone else in the last 10 minutes. As he crunched along the gravel path, the silence of the village felt unnerving. Usually, there was the distant clatter of Archie McLean's tractor or the rhythmic thud of Mrs. Kennedy beating a rug. But today, the fog seemed to have pressed a heavy thumb down on the world. Even the gulls were silent, huddled on the pier like mourners in grey coats. He was halfway to the hotel when a sound tore through the muffled air. It wasn't a scream of anger or even a call for help. It was a high, thin squawk of a bird in distress, followed by a dull, wet thud that set Lugs's hackles on end. Hamish broke into a loping run, his long legs eating up the distance. As he rounded the corner of the hotel's kitchen garden, he found Jessie McLean, the youngest chambermaid, standing with her hands clamped over her mouth. She was pointing toward the large, ornate fountain that Percy Thorne had insisted on installing in the center of the village square as a gift to the community. "Oh, Hamish, it's him. It's that awful man," Jessie wailed, her eyes wide and watery. Hamish stepped past her, his gaze dropping to the fountain. There, wedged between two stone cherubs and draped in a tangle of blue and green feathers, was Percival Thorne. The Sassenach property developer was no longer looking pristine or arrogant. He was face down in the shallow, soapy water, his expensive tweed jacket ruined by the overflowing suds, but it was the manner of his death that caused Hamish to wince with a mixture of professional annoyance and grim curiosity. One of his missing peacocks had been stuffed, quite unceremoniously, into the back of his tweed jacket, its long, iridescent tail feathers fanned out over his head like a macabre, mocking crown. The other bird sat perched atop a nearby stone wall, letting out a piercing, triumphant shriek that echoed across the square. "Well now," Hamish muttered, crouching down to peer at the body, "that is a very specific way to go, Mr. Thorne. You wanted an investigation into your birds, and it seems they've brought the investigation directly to you." He felt a familiar sinking sensation in his chest. A murder in the village was bad enough, but a murder involving ornamental poultry and a public fountain was the sort of bizarre detail that would bring the Strathbane police down on Lockduff like a plague of locusts. He looked at his watch. It was just past 2. By 3 o'clock, DCI Blair would be here, shouting at everyone and trampling over every blade of grass in a 3-mile radius. Hamish's quiet day was officially buried under a mountain of impending paperwork and loud-mouthed incompetence. He reached out a long, careful finger to touch the edge of Thorne's jacket. The man was stone cold. As he stood up, he noticed a single polished silver button lying on the wet stone near the fountain's edge. It didn't look like it had come from Thorne's expensive tweed. It looked like a button from a much older, much humbler garment. Hamish sighed, the cold rain beginning to seep into his collar. The piece of Lockduff hadn't just been shattered, it had been plucked clean. The silence of the village square, broken only by the mournful shrieks of the surviving peacock, was abruptly torn apart by the discordant wail of sirens. Hamish Macbeth didn't need to look at his watch to know that the Strathbane police had made record time, likely fueled by the prospect of a high-profile murder involving a wealthy Londoner. 3 white patrol cars and a black unmarked sedan skidded onto the wet slate of the square, splashing soapy fountain water over the cobbles. The lead car's door flew open before the engine, had even ceased its rattling, and out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He looked, as he always did, like a man whose blood pressure was currently engaged in a violent struggle with his shirt collar. His face was a shade of alarming magenta, and his small, piggy eyes were already scanning the scene for someone to shout at. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the Lochtabuff Hotel like a foghorn. "What in the name of all that is holy is this circus? I get a report of a drowning, and I find a night of industry decorated like a Christmas tree with poultry. This is a mockery of the force, you useless Highland peasant. Why haven't you cordoned off the area? Why is that, Mangy orange rug of yours currently sniffing the evidence?" Hamish tipped his peaked cap, his expression settling into its most vacuous and unthreatening mask. He stood tall and lanky beside the fountain, looking every bit the slow-witted village bobby. "Afternoon, sir. It's a tragic business, surely. Mr. Thorne seems to have had a bit of an unfortunate encounter with his own garden features. Lugs was just checking for." "Ah, suspicious sense, sir. Very thorough he is." Blair ignored him, stomping toward the fountain with a lack of grace that sent a fresh spray of suds over his polished shoes. He stared at Percy Thorne's body, his lip curling in a mixture of disgust and professional irritation. Behind him, Detectives Anderson and Macnab scrambled to set up a perimeter, looking thoroughly miserable in the unrelenting drizzle. Blair didn't bother with a careful approach. He leaned over the stone cherubs, nearly poking the deceased with a thick, accusatory finger. "It's obvious what's happened here," Blair snapped, turning back to his team. "It's a local prank gone wrong. Some drunken lout from the village thought he'd play a trick on the wealthy outsider, stuffed his bird down his neck and pushed him in. It's manslaughter, at the very least. Probably that Archie McLean. He was complaining about Thorne's Range Rover blocking the sheep pens just yesterday. Anderson, go and fetch McLean. I want him in handcuffs before the tea is cold." "Archie was at the far shieling all morning, sir," Hamish interjected softly, his Highland drawl even slower than usual. "I saw him heading up the track with his collie before the mist, even lifted. And the bird, sir, it wasn't just stuffed there. It was positioned quite deliberately. And there's the matter of this button." He reached into his pocket to show the silver button he'd found, but Blair swiped his hand away as if batting at a fly. "I don't pay you to have opinions on buttons or sheep tracks, Macbeth," Blair screamed, his face turning an even deeper shade of purple. "I pay you to keep the peace and stay out of my way. You're a disgrace to the uniform. You probably stood here and watched it happen while you were dreaming of poached salmon. Now, get back to your station and stay there. We'll handle the real police work. Macnab, secure the hotel entrance. I want a list of every person in this village who's ever expressed a dislike for peacocks, and I want it now." Hamish sighed, a long, misty breath that vanished into the damp air. He watched as Blair began stomping around the fountain, his heavy shoes trampling over the very scuffed moss and watermarks Hamish had been trying to observe. The DCI's lack of care was almost impressive. He was currently kicking a loose stone right over a set of faint, muddy boot prints that didn't belong to a Londoner. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who trotted back to his side with a look of equal disdain for the Strathbane interlopers. He knew better than to argue further. A red-faced Blair was a deaf Blair. "We'll be going then, sir," Hamish said mildly, his eyes catching the glint of something metallic near the fountain's base that Blair had completely missed. "If you need me, I'll be at the station checking the, lost and found records. Purely for gossip, you understand." Blair waved him away with a dismissive grunt, already shouting at Anderson about the lack of a proper forensic tent. Hamish turned his back on the shouting and the flashing blue lights, his mind already categorizing the facts that Blair was so eager to ignore. The peacock wasn't a prank. It was a statement of profound Highland contempt, and the silver button, now safely tucked into Hamish's own pocket despite Blair's incompetence, suggested that Percy Thorne's last visitor hadn't been a drunken lout, but someone with a very old, very specific grievance. As he walked toward the village, Hamish felt the familiar itch of a mystery that required a much quieter touch than a Strathbane boot. The heavy, wet boots of DCI Blair continued to clatter against the stone cobbles behind him, But Hamish Macbeth did not look back. He walked with a deceptive, slow-motion gait that suggested a man whose greatest concern was the dampness of his socks rather than the murder of a millionaire. Lugs trotted at his side, occasionally pausing to shake a spray of rainwater from his orange coat, his mismatched ears twitching at every distant shout from the fountain. Hamish didn't head for the police station. Instead, he steered himself toward the village high street, specifically toward the warm, yellow glow of the local post office and general store. In Lockduff, forensic labs were a distant myth whispered about in Strathbane, but the postmistress's counter was a clearinghouse for every whispered secret and hidden grudge within a 50-mile radius of the lock. The bell above the door gave a cheerful, brassy chime as Hamish stepped inside. The air was a heady mix of floor wax, peppermint, and the faint, earthy scent of damp wool. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was currently engaged in a heated debate with the minister's wife, Mrs. Wellington, over the rising price of digestive biscuits. Both women froze as Hamish approached, their eyes darting to his uniform and then toward the window, hoping for a fresh glimpse of the drama unfolding in the square. Hamish leaned heavily against the wooden counter, projecting an aura of complete, harmless exhaustion that usually prompted people to fill the silence with information. "It is a terrible day to be out, ladies," Hamish drawled, his Highland accent becoming a touch thicker. "I don't suppose a man could find a bit of comfort in a ginger nut. My stomach is fairly complaining." Mrs. Kennedy sniffed, her indignation momentarily overriding her curiosity. "You look like a ghost, Hamish Macbeth, and I hear that loudmouth from Strathbane is currently shouting at the gulls. Is it true, then?" Mr. Thorne found face down in his own vanity project, with a peacock for a pillow. "Aye, it's a sad business," Hamish replied, accepting a biscuit with a grateful nod. "A very strange way to go. DCI Blair thinks it's a local prank. Perhaps someone like Archie McLean, taking offense at the Range Rover. But I keep wondering why a man would choose a peacock. It seems like a lot of effort for a simple shove." Mrs. Wellington narrowed her eyes, her lips thinning into a straight line. "Effort? It was a judgment, Hamish. That man was a menace. Do you know he had the audacity to suggest we move the war memorial because it obstructed the light for his new conservatory? He told old Mr. McTavish that his croft was an eyesore. McTavish has been there for 80 years, and his family for 300 before him." Hamish chewed his biscuit, thoughtfully, his mind filing away the name McTavish. "Old Angus McTavish. I haven't seen him at the hotel for a week. I heard he was unwell." "He's more than unwell. He's heartbroken," Mrs. Kennedy whispered, leaning over the counter until her spectacles nearly touched Hamish's nose. Thorne was trying to buy the access road to the lower grazing lands. He told Angus that if he didn't sell, he'd find a way to have the council condemn the cottage. Angus was seen shouting at him outside the curry shop 2 nights ago. He was wearing that old silver-buttoned waistcoat of his, the one he only wears for Kirk or for war. Hamish felt a slight prickle of interest at the mention of the waistcoat. He reached into his pocket and fingered the silver button he had salvaged from the fountain, its smooth surface a sharp contrast to the rough tweed of his coat. And did anyone else have words with Mr. Thorne? A man with that much money usually attracts a particular kind of company. There was a woman, Mrs. Wellington added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. A flashy thing, in a red sports car, stayed at the lodge for 2 nights. They were heard arguing about royalties and the London contract. She left in a fury this morning, just before the mist came down. Nearly took the door off the hotel garage on her way out. Hamish thanked the ladies and stepped back out into the mist, his mind already weaving the fragments together. Blair was looking for a drunken lout, but Hamish was beginning to see a much darker pattern of Highland displacement and metropolitan greed. He moved toward the Patel's curry shop, the Highland Spice, hoping for a bit of warmth and perhaps a few more pieces of the puzzle. In Lockdover, the truth was rarely found in the shouting. It was hidden in the tea leaves and the silences between the gossip. The damp Highland air seemed to cling to Hamish Macbeth's skin as he stepped away from the post office, his mind whirring beneath a shock of unruly red hair The mention of the flashy woman in the red sports car and the heated argument over royalties added a layer of metropolitan grime to a case that DCI Blair was currently trying to solve with a sledgehammer. As Hamish began the long, uphill trudge toward Tommel Castle, his thoughts drifted toward the one person in Lochdubuff who could navigate the murky waters of the English upper class with more grace than a Highland salmon. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local colonel, was currently staying at the estate, and her insight into the world of London contracts and the social dynamics of the wealthy would be far more valuable than anything Blair's team could dig up with their heavy-duty forensics. Lugs trotted at his side, occasionally stopping to sniff a frost-rimed clump of heather before sneezing loudly in the crisp, biting wind. As they reached the castle's iron gates, Hamish spotted Priscilla's Land Rover parked near the stables. She was dressed in an effortlessly elegant barber jacket and well-cut moleskin trousers. Looking every bit the country aristocrat, she spotted Hamish and offered a small, knowing smile that always made him feel slightly more unkempt and awkward than usual. It was a complicated relationship. Hamish adored her, but his fear of being tamed and moved to a city apartment usually kept his romantic impulses firmly under wraps. "I heard the sirens, Hamish," she said, her voice like a cool stream over smooth stones. "And I heard about Percy Thorne. The village is buzzing with the news of a peacock. It's all very bizarre, even for a Tuesday in Lochdubuff." "Aye, it's a strange world we're living in, Priscilla," Hamish replied, leaning against a stone pillar and trying to look as though he hadn't just hiked 2 miles up a mountain. "DCI Blair is convinced it's a local grudge, perhaps old Angus McTavish, but I've heard talk of a woman in a red car. They were shouting about royalties at the lodge." "Does that name Thorne mean anything to you beyond his terrible taste in fountains?" Priscilla's expression tightened ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her pale eyes. "He wasn't just a property developer, Hamish. He was a silent partner in several London publishers. He had a reputation for buying property rights and then squeezing heirs for every penny. My father was quite taken with the idea. Thorne promised it would increase the estate's land value significantly. But there was a guest at dinner 2 nights ago, Miss Clarissa Vane. She was furious. Apparently, Thorne had acquired the copyright to her late father's memoirs and was planning to publish them with a particularly scandalous slant." "Clarissa Vane, you say?" Hamish mused, scratching his chin with a slow, rhythmic motion. "And did this Clarissa happen to have a red sports car?" "She did," Priscilla agreed, stepping closer, "and she was staying at the hotel until this morning. But Hamish, you're looking at it the wrong way. Thorne was bragging about a secret weapon he'd found within the village, someone who was going to help him bypass the local council's objections to his development plans. It seemed like a strange thing for a Londoner to say." Hamish felt a prickle of interest at the back of his neck. A secret weapon in a village like Lochdubuff? A secret was a rare and precious commodity, usually guarded with more ferocity than a golden eagle's nest. If Thorne had been double-crossing the very people he was supposedly working with, or if his partner had realized Thorne was more liability than asset, the motive for murder became much clearer than a simple territorial dispute. He reached into his pocket and produced the silver button he had found on the pier. He held it out on his palm, the polished metal glinting in the dull Highland light. "Does this look familiar? Mrs. Kennedy thinks it belongs to Angus McTavish's old waistcoat." Priscilla leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "It's a very old design, Hamish, but look at the back. It's been reinforced with modern nylon thread. Someone went to great lengths to make it look like an old Highland relic, but they used a city sewing kit. You're being led on a merry dance, Hamish. Someone wants you to think this is a village feud, but the thread tells a different story entirely." Hamish sighed, the weight of the mystery settling more firmly on his shoulders. He had a witness who saw a theft, a silver button that pointed to a local, and a motive rooted in a failing investment scheme. It was a classic tale of greed, far removed from the drunken lout theory Blair was pursuing. He thanked Priscilla and began the descent back into the fog, his mind already setting the first pieces of a trap. He knew that the real killer wasn't hiding in a croft. They were likely sitting in the hotel lounge, waiting for the stupid policeman to arrest the wrong man. The walk back down from Tommel Castle was a treacherous affair. The path slick with a mixture of Highland mud and frozen moss that seemed intent on upending anyone with a heavy heart or a preoccupied mind. Hamish Macbeth walked with a purposeful, loping stride, his long legs absorbing the uneven terrain while lugs darted through the heather, his orange coat a blur against the grey granite. The conversation with Priscilla had provided the final, sharp edge to the hazy picture forming in his mind. The reinforced nylon thread on a supposedly ancient silver button was a detail so small, it would have escaped a man like Blair entirely. But to Hamish, it was a screaming neon sign. It suggested a crime that was not born of spontaneous Highland rage, but of a calculated attempt to mimic it. As he reached the outskirts of the village, the familiar, discordant sound of a shouting match drifted over the stone walls near the old schoolhouse. He slowed his pace, peering through the shifting curtains of mist to see DCI Blair's team in a state of high-octane activity. A group of uniformed officers from Strathbane were currently surrounding a small, battered blue van. Standing in the center of the road, looking like a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience, was Archie McLean. The local handyman and occasional shepherd was being held firmly by Detective Anderson, while Blair loomed over him, his face a shade of violet that suggested an impending medical emergency. "I've got you now, you Highland savage," Blair bellowed, brandishing a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag sat a tangled mess of peacock feathers and a heavy, rusted iron bar. "We found these in the back of your van, McLean, along with a set of muddy boots that match the scuff marks on the fountain's edge. You were seen arguing with the deceased about a parking space only yesterday. It's a classic case of local resentment turning into cold-blooded murder. You thought you'd be clever, decorating him like a trophy, didn't you? I tell ye, man," Archie wheezed, his Highland burr thick with indignation and a hint of genuine fear. "I found those feathers in the road this morning. I was going to give them to my niece for her hat. And that bar, it's for the tractor. I was at the far shield, as Hamish here can tell ye, if he's got the sense he was born with." Hamish stepped forward, his expression settling into a mask of mild, wide-eyed confusion, the very image of a man who found shoelaces a mental challenge. "Afternoon, sir. Is everything all right? I see you've been busy while I was just wandering about, looking at the scenery. It's a grand day for an arrest, I suppose." Blair whirled around, his eyes bulging with triumph. "Everything is perfectly handled, Macbeth. No thanks to your mooching. We've found the weapon, or the blunt instrument for it, and the suspect has no alibi that holds water. The bus driver says he didn't see McLean on the return trip from the lower grazing lands. He must have hitched back early to intercept Thorn at the fountain." Hamish leaned against a nearby stone wall, tilting his peaked cap back. "That is a very thorough job, sir. Truly impressive. But I couldn't help but notice something odd about those feathers in your bag. They're very clean, aren't they? Almost as if they've been plucked from a dead bird in a dry room, rather than one that's been rolling about in a soapy fountain in the rain. And Archie here. Well, Archie's van has a hole in the floorboard the size of a dinner plate. If he'd been driving about with loose feathers, they'd have been sucked out by the draft miles ago." Blair blinked, staring at the evidence bag. The feathers were indeed pristine, lacking the bedraggled, oily look of the ones currently floating in the village square. "It doesn't matter," Blair snapped, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. He could have kept them in a box. The fact remains that he had the motive and the opportunity. "Of course, sir," Hamish drawled, stepping back with a respectful nod. "But while you're processing, Archie, you might want to ask why Miss Clarissa Vane's red sports car was seen parked behind the old curing sheds this morning, well away from the hotel, and why there's a sewing kit in her glove box, with the exact same shade of nylon thread used to reinforce the button I found. I happened to notice it while I was making sure she hadn't left her lights on. Purely out of concern for her battery, you understand?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Blair's bruised ego. He looked at Anderson, who was already beginning to loosen his grip on Archie's arm. The perfect case against the locals was dissolving, replaced by the messy reality of an outsider with expensive tastes and a sewing kit. Hamish watched as Blair barked a new set of orders, his rage pivoting away from Archie and toward the hotel. The trap was beginning to tighten, but Hamish knew that a loud-mouthed DCI wouldn't catch Clarissa Vane. He needed a much more delicate bait, one that involved a quiet chat and a very specific lie. The mist seemed to thicken as Hamish Macbeth watched DCI Blair's team scramble toward the Lockdove Hotel, their sirens echoing off the damp stone walls like a pack of hounds in full cry. Archie McLean stood by his battered blue van, trembling with a mixture of relief and lingering fury, but Hamish only offered him a slow, reassuring nod before turning away. He did not follow screaming detectives. Instead, he whistled for lugs and set a course back toward the old curing sheds, a place where the scent of salt and ancient rot usually kept the tourists at bay. He knew that Blair would find Clarissa Vane in the hotel lounge, and she would undoubtedly have a clever answer for every loudmouth accusation. A woman who could reinforce a silver button with modern nylon thread was not a woman who would crack under a bit of Strathbane bluster. As he walked, Hamish's mind returned to the secret weapon Priscilla had mentioned. Percy Thorne hadn't just been a greedy developer. He was a man who understood leverage. In a place like Lockdove, leverage wasn't always about money. It was about the stories people told themselves to stay respectable. He thought of Clarissa Vane, the daughter of a man whose memoirs were about to be weaponized by Thorne. The royalties were a motive, certainly, but they were too clean, too logical for a murder involving a fountain and a peacock. There was something pettier at play, something that smelled of social embarrassment and the crushing weight of a ruined reputation. He reached the sheds and sat on an upturned lobster creel, pulling a small, battered tin from his pocket. He began to roll a cigarette with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes fixed on the grey expanse of the loch. Lugs sat at his feet, his ears pricked toward the village. Hamish thought about the peacock again. To an outsider like Blair, it was a bizarre prank. To a local like Archie, it was a waste of good feathers. But to someone like Clarissa Vane, who lived in a world of symbols and status, it was a specific kind of humiliation. It was a proud bird, decorative and loud, much like Thorne himself. By stuffing it down his jacket, the killer wasn't just hiding a weapon. They were making a satirical point about vanity. A faint sound broke the rhythmic slap of the water, the crunch of a boot on loose gravel. It wasn't the heavy, aggressive stomp of a Strathbane policeman, but the light, hesitant step of someone trying to be invisible. Out of the fog emerged Mr. Johnson, the mild-mannered village minister. He looked startled to find Hamish sitting there, his black coat glistening with droplets of moisture. "A dark day, Hamish," the minister murmured, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "A dark day indeed for our little community. I hear the police are questioning Miss Vane, a very spirited young woman." "Spirited is one word for it, Minister," Hamish replied, blowing a thin stream of smoke into the damp air, "though I'm wondering why a spirited woman from London would know so much about the stitching on a Highland waistcoat, or why she'd be so concerned about her father's memoirs being published. Unless, of course, the memoirs weren't just scandalous. Unless they contained something that would make her silent partner status, in those London firms, quite impossible to maintain." The minister stared at the water, his expression pained. "Pride is horrible, Hamish. It goads people into doing things they never thought possible. Mr. Thorne wasn't just going to publish a book. He was going to reveal a truth that would have stripped Miss Vane of her position in society. He held the only copy of the original manuscript. He called it his insurance policy." Hamish stood up, the puzzle finally clicking into place. The hidden motive wasn't money. It was the preservation of a lie. Clarissa Vane hadn't just been arguing about royalties. She had been pleading for her social life, and when Thorne laughed at her, she had struck him with the first thing she found, the iron bar from Archie's van, which Thorne had probably complained about earlier. Then, in a fit of cold, calculated irony, she had used the peacock to frame the very savage Highlanders she so despised. But she had made one mistake. She had used her own sewing kit to fix the button she'd torn from Thorne's grasp during the struggle. trying to make it look like a local souvenir. "Thank you, Minister," Hamish said softly, stubbing out his cigarette. "You've confirmed a suspicion I had. It was not about land. It was about the fear of being seen for who we really are." He whistled for lugs and began to walk back toward the village. But he didn't head for the hotel. He knew exactly where Clarissa Vane would be going next. She would not be bullied by Blair. She would go back to the lodge to find that manuscript. The one thing she had killed for, and the one thing she hadn't yet found. And Hamish Macbeth would be waiting there to offer her a very quiet, very final cup of tea. The minister's silhouette dissolved into the grey Highland mist as Hamish Macbeth set off toward the lodge, his pace deceptively leisurely. To any onlooker, he appeared to be a man merely strolling home to avoid a downpour. But his mind was clicking through the final gear of a very specific machinery. He knew DCI Blair would currently be at the hotel, purple-faced and screaming about warrants, while Clarissa Vane played the part of the offended metropolitan lady. But Clarissa was too smart to stay under that particular spotlight for long. She would have realized by now that Blair was a blustering distraction, and that the real threat lay in the quiet, red-haired constable who had noticed her sewing kit. More importantly, she knew that with Percy Thorne dead, the original manuscript of her father's memoirs, the one containing the ruinous truth about her family's wealth, was still hidden somewhere in Thorne's study at the lodge. Hamish didn't take the main road. He cut through the back of the village, moving through the sodden heather of the hills that overlooked the Thorne estate. Lugs trotted silently beside him, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The lodge was a sprawling, modern monstrosity of glass and cedar that looked entirely out of place against the rugged Highland granite. As Hamish reached the perimeter, he saw the faint flicker of a flashlight moving behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of the library. Clarissa hadn't wasted any time. She had bypassed the police tape with the practiced ease of someone who believed rules were for the savages she so often mocked. Hamish didn't burst in. That was Blair's way, and it usually resulted in nothing but broken glass and lost evidence. Instead, he made his way to the back kitchen door, which he knew Thorne always left unlocked for the organic vegetable deliveries. He slipped inside, the air smelling of expensive floor wax and stale air. He moved toward the library, his boots making no sound on the plush Persian rugs. He could hear the frantic shuffling of papers and the rhythmic clicking of drawers being opened and shut. "It's in the third volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica, Miss Vane," Hamish said softly, leaning against the doorframe of the library. Under P for pride. Mr. Thorne had a very predictable sense of humour. Clarissa Vane spun around, the flashlight in her hand cutting a jagged arc through the darkness. She was dressed in a dark trench coat, her face pale and sharp in the artificial light. In her other hand, she clutched a thick, yellowed sheaf of papers, the manuscript. Her eyes weren't filled with the fear of a common criminal. They were burning with the cold, aristocratic rage of a woman whose world was being dismantled by a man she considered an inferior. "You," she hissed, the flashlight beam trembling slightly as it caught Hamish's calm, blue eyes. "The simple village policeman. I should have known you were more than just a decorative piece of the scenery." "I try to be useful, Miss Vane," Hamish drawled, his Highland accent thick and seemingly innocuous. "Though I'm surprised you came back for this. DCI Blair is now convinced. Archie McLean is the one who did it for Mr. Thorne. If you just stayed in the hotel and looked upset, you might have gotten away with it. But you couldn't leave the truth behind, could you? You had to be sure no one would ever see what your father really wrote." Clarissa straightened her shoulders, her grip tightening on the papers. "You have no idea what it's like, Macbeth. To have a name that means something, and to have a man like Thorne threaten to drag it through the mud for a few £1,000s of royalties. He was a parasite. He didn't deserve the air he breathed." "Maybe so," Hamish agreed, taking a slow step into the room. "But the fountain was a bit much, don't you think? And the peacock, that was a very personal touch. It told me that whoever killed him didn't just want him dead, they wanted to humiliate him. And that pointed straight to someone who felt humiliated by him, someone who'd been treated like an ornamental bird for too long." Clarissa's lip curled. "He treated everyone like dirt. I simply returned the favour." She looked at the manuscript, then at the fireplace where a small pilot light flickered. And now, I'm going to ensure that his last bit of leverage vanishes into smoke. You can't stop me, Macbeth. You're just one man in a damp village. Hamish didn't move toward her. He simply whistled, a low, sharp sound. From the shadows behind Clarissa, Lugs let out a low, guttural growl that sounded like shifting boulders. Clarissa froze, the flashlight beam dropping to the floor. The trap was finally snapped shut. But as the wind rattled the glass panes of the lodge, Hamish knew that the confrontation was far from over. A cornered shark was always more dangerous than a feeding one. The library of the lodge felt smaller now, the shadows pressing inward as the wind from the lock rattled the expansive glass panes. Clarissa Vane stood rigid, her knuckles white as she clutched the yellowed manuscript to her chest. The low, rhythmic growl from Lugs behind her seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A primal warning that she was no longer the apex predator in this Highland room. Hamish Macbeth stood perfectly still, his long, lanky frame silhouetted against the hallway light, looking less like a bumbling village bobby and more like a weary shepherd who had finally cornered a particularly troublesome wolf. The air between them was thick with the scent of old paper, salt air, and the sharp ozone tang of a storm about to break. "It's over, Miss Vane," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that commanded the room. The game was clever enough, I'll grant you that, staging a Highland grudge, using poor Archie's iron bar, and even taking the time to fix that button with your own city-bought thread. But you forgot that in a place like Lockduff, we don't just see the scenery, we see the people who don't fit into it. And you, with your red car and your royalties and your father's dirty secrets, you stood out like a flare in a dark glen. Clarissa's eyes darted toward the fireplace, a flicker of desperate calculation crossing her features. "You have nothing, Macbeth. No witnesses, no fingerprints. Just the word of a man who spends his days poaching and talking to a mongrel. I'm going to burn this, and then I'm going to walk out of here. If you try to stop me, I'll tell the DCI you assaulted me while I was merely retrieving my belongings from a dead friend's house." "Is that so?" Hamish drawled, taking a slow, measured step forward. DCI Blair might be a loud-mouthed fool, but even he knows how to recognize a confession when it's shouted in his face. And as for witnesses, well, the Highland air has a funny way of carrying voices. But more importantly, you've still got that iron bar hidden, haven't you? The one you didn't leave in Archie's van. You couldn't risk it being found too soon, so you kept it. I'd wager it's in the boot of that red car of yours, wrapped in a silk scarf. The mention of the bar seemed to snap something inside her. With a strangled cry of pure, aristocratic rage, Clarissa lunged. She didn't go for the fireplace. She threw the heavy manuscript straight at Hamish's face and followed it with a savage, clawing attack. She wasn't a fighter, but she possessed a manic, desperate strength fueled by the terror of social ruin. Hamish moved with a deceptive, fluid grace, ducking the flying papers as they fanned out like white wings in the dark. He caught her wrists in a grip that was as firm as iron and as inescapable as a Highland winter. "That's enough, Clarissa," he panted, his chest heaving as he pinned her arms behind her back. "There's no dignity in this. You've already killed a man over a few pages of ink. Don't add a dead policeman to the tally, or even Blair won't be able to ignore the truth." Lugs was suddenly at her heels, barking with a fierce, bone-shaking intensity that broke the last of her resolve. Clarissa collapsed against Hamish's chest, her body shaking with jagged, dry sobs. The manuscript lay scattered across the Persian rug, the secrets of her family finally exposed to the indifferent Highland knight. Hamish reached into his greatcoat and produced a pair of heavy, cold iron handcuffs. They clicked shut with a metallic finality that seemed to echo through the empty lodge. "Why couldn't you just let him have his little book?" Hamish whispered, more to himself than her. "Was it worth all this? The blood in the fountain, and the bird and the lies?" Clarissa didn't answer. She looked toward the window, where the mist was finally beginning to lift, revealing the dark, cold waters of the loch. She looked like a broken doll, her expensive trench coat rumpled and her pride stripped away. Hamish led her toward the kitchen door, his hand firm on her arm. He knew that the hardest part of the night was over, but he still had to deal with the blustering storm that was DCI Blair. He needed to ensure that the arrest looked like a masterstroke of Strathbane genius, or he'd be answering phones in a city precinct by Monday morning. He whistled for lugs, tucked the scattered pages of the manuscript under his arm, and began the long, quiet walk back toward the village lights. The walk back to the village police station was a slow, somber trek through the lifting curtains of Highland mist. Hamish Macbeth marched Clarissa Vane ahead of him, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically on the wet tarmac, a sharp contrast to the soft, heavy thud of his own boots and the steady padding of Lugs's paws. The young woman was silent now, her aristocratic fire extinguished by the cold iron of the handcuffs and the weight of the manuscript Hamish carried tucked firmly under his arm. As they rounded the corner toward the village square, the glare of several sets of headlights cut through the gloom. DCI Blair was standing by the fountain, looking like a particularly irritable volcano on the verge of eruption, still shouting orders at a weary Detective Anderson, while the surviving Peacock watched from a nearby roof with a cynical tilt of its head. Macbeth, Blair bellowed, storming forward with a gait that suggested he was about to explode into 1,000 tiny pieces of red-faced fury. What in the name of all that is holy is this? I told you to stay out of my sight. Who is this woman? And why have you got my handcuffs on her? I've just finished processing McLean, and now you bring me more paperwork. Hamish stopped, offering a look of profound, wide-eyed innocence that he had practiced in front of his shaving mirror for years. He let his shoulders slump and adopted an even slower, more hesitant Highland drawl than usual, projecting the image of a man who had accidentally stumbled into a solution. Oh, hello, sir. I'm terribly sorry to bother you when you're so busy with the big arrest. It's just, well, I found Miss Vane at the lodge. She was acting very strangely, trying to set fire to these old papers. She seemed quite upset, sir. Kept babbling about how she'd tried to frame poor Archie because she couldn't stand the thought of Mr. Thorne revealing her father's secrets. I thought I'd better bring her to you, since you're the expert on these metropolitan types. Blair squinted at Clarissa, who was currently shivering and staring at the wet cobbles with a hollow, defeated expression. Framed him? Don't be ridiculous, Macbeth. I've already established the local grudge as the primary motive. Why would a lady like this involve herself with poultry and fountains? Aye, that's what I thought too, sir, Hamish said, nodding vigorously like a man eager to agree with his superior. But then she started showing me where she'd hidden the iron bar. It's in the boot of her red car, wrapped in a silk scarf, just like you probably suspected. And she told me all about the nylon thread she used to fix that button. It seems she was trying to outsmart you, sir. A terrible insult to a man of your legendary experience. She thought. A big city detective wouldn't notice a tiny detail, like a modern thread on an old Highland waistcoat. Blair's ears turned a vivid shade of crimson, a sure sign that his vanity had been successfully baited. The idea that someone had attempted to outsmart him was far more offensive than the murder itself. He approached Clarissa, looming over her with an air of newfound authority. Is this true? You thought you could lead the Strathbane Cid on a wild goose chase by playing at being a local. You thought I wouldn't notice the discrepancy in the evidence. Clarissa looked up, her voice a jagged whisper of pure resentment. He was a parasite, detective. He deserved to be mocked. He was going to take everything, Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that perfectly mimicked a man who was ready for his bed. It's a real shame, sir. I suppose I should have called you sooner, but I didn't want to interrupt your brilliant work with the suspects in the village. If you want, I can take her into the station and start the preliminary forms. And you can tell the chief constable how you managed to smoke out the real killer by putting pressure on the locals until the partner cracked and revealed herself. It was a masterpiece of psychological profiling. Purely brilliant. Blair paused, the gears of his immense ambition turning visibly behind his small, piggy eyes. If he arrested Clarissa Vane now, he could claim that the focus on Archie McLean had been a cunning tactical feint designed to lure the real culprit into a false sense of security. It would look like a triumph of modern policing, rather than a series of lucky guesses by a village bobby. He looked at Hamish, suspicious as always, but the constable just looked tired and slightly dim-witted. A feint, Blair muttered, smoothing his coat and puffing out his chest. Yes, exactly. I knew the handyman was too obvious. I wanted to see who would return to the scene of the crime to destroy the motive. And it worked. Anderson, get this woman in the van. Release the McLean fellow. Tell him he's lucky I'm in a merciful mood. And Macbeth, give me those papers. I'll be the one writing the final report on this sting operation. Hamish handed the manuscript with a respectful nod. Of course, sir. It's all your doing. I was just the boots on the ground. I'm sure the papers in Strathbane will be very impressed with your Highland strategy. As the police cars roared away toward the main road, their sirens fading into the distance, Hamish stood in the middle of the square. He had avoided the promotion, saved Archie, and ensured the real killer was caught, all while making Blair feel like a genius. It was a perfect result. He turned toward his cottage, thinking of the cold salmon sitting in his kitchen and the warmth of his peat fire. The peace of Lochduff was restored, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the only credit that ever truly mattered. The following morning, the sun broke through the Highland mist with a rare golden clarity that made the waters of the loch sparkle like spilled diamonds. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the comforting, heavy scent of peat smoke and frying bacon. Hamish Macbeth stood over his small, blackened stove, expertly flipping a thick slice of black pudding, while Luggs sat at his feet, his nose twitching in a rhythmic dance of pure anticipation. The chaos of the previous night, the sirens, the shouting, and the purple-faced fury of DCI Blair already felt like a distant, unpleasant dream. Filed away in the back of Hamish's mind alongside other nuisances like tax returns and modern technology, a soft, familiar knock at the door preceded the arrival of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked radiant in a cream-colored wool sweater, though her expression was one of quiet, weary amusement. She carried a small basket covered with a crisp linen cloth, the smell of fresh scones wafting through the room. "I hear the village is safe once more, Hamish," she said, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen and casting a critical eye over his cluttered table. "And I hear from the post office that DCI Blair is currently being hailed in the Strathbane papers as a master of psychological profiling for his brilliant trap involving Archie McLean and the secret manuscript." Hamish chuckled, sliding a plate of breakfast onto the wooden table with a flourish. The DCI is a very talented man. Priscilla, it takes a special kind of genius to be so wrong that you eventually come out the other side of being right. As long as he stays in Strathbane and leaves us to our peace, he can call himself the King of Scotland. For all I care, he's happy with his headlines, and I'm happy with my stove. Priscilla set her basket on the counter, her eyes softening as she watched him. "My father sent these, a few bottles of his best claret and some venison steaks. He's relieved that the business of the housing development has been buried along with Mr. Thorne's ambitions. It seems the secret weapon Thorne boasted about was nothing more than a collection of old lies that have now been securely locked in a police evidence locker." "That is very kind of the Colonel," Hamish said, his eyes gleaming at the prospect of the venison. He sat down, pouring a mug of tea that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. Lochduff isn't a place for holiday pods and Italian cars. It's a place for things that take time to grow and even longer to change. Percy Thorne tried to move the mountains, and the mountains simply sat on him. They sat in a companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional happy grunt from Luggs as he received a well-deserved morsel of bacon. The mystery was solved, the outsider was gone, and the subtle, ancient balance of the village had been restored. Through the window, Hamish could see old Angus MacTavish limping toward the pier, his pipe firmly clenched in his teeth, looking none the worse for his brief stint as a suspected murderer. He was wearing a plain wool waistcoat today, the silver-buttoned one likely hidden away until the next Kirk service. "You really don't mind, do you?" Priscilla asked softly, watching him over the rim of her tea mug. "Letting Blair take all the credit for your work. You could have been a sergeant now, Hamish. You could have your own department in a city, with a proper salary, and a car that doesn't break down every time it sees a hill." Hamish looked around his small, cluttered kitchen, the chipped mugs, the soot-stained hearth, the dog sleeping on his boots, and the vast untamed mountains looming outside his door. He thought of the grey pavements of Glasgow and the endless, soul-crushing paperwork of a promotion. A slow, contented smile spread across his face, reaching his sharp blue eyes. And give up all this, Priscilla. I'm a lazy man, remember? And it takes a terrible amount of effort to be a sergeant. Besides, he added, taking a long, satisfying sip of his tea, as the first few drops of a fresh Highland drizzle began to tap against the glass, Summonen has to keep an eye on the salmon in the loch. It's a full-time job, ensuring they don't get lonely. And Blair wouldn't know a salmon from a sardine if it bit him on the nose. As Priscilla laughed and prepared to leave, Hamish felt a deep, resonant sense of satisfaction. The stupid village policeman had won again. He had protected his neighbours, satisfied the law, and, most importantly, secured his right to remain exactly where he was. When the door closed, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, drifting into a light, peaceful doze. The rain intensified, returning the Highlands to their natural, misty state. Lochtabuff was quiet, the air was cool, and for Hamish Macbeth, life was exactly as it should be.